So in our last video, we talked about demand. Just to remind ourselves really quickly about what we learned, think about demand as being the willingness and ability of people to buy whatever quantities they want to buy at each price they might see. Demand is a relationship. So demand is never a number. We're never going to say demand is 10. Demand is an entire relationship between price and quantity. And we talked about how demand can be represented in three common ways. A demand schedule, which is a table that lists for each price you might see, what quantity might people want to buy. We could represent that table as a graph, and we usually call that a demand curve, even if it's a straight line, because normally demand is a curve. In this class, we'll use lines because they're much easier to work with. So demand schedule is a table, a demand curve is a graph, or we could have a demand equation or demand function to represent exactly the same information three different ways. And what demand, what someone or some group of people's demand tells us is how the quantity changes as the price changes. Or we can think about it as demand is a list of the highest price people would be willing to pay for each amount. The highest price people are willing to pay for each quantity, or what quantity do people want to buy at each price they might see. Two ways of looking at the same kind of thing. So if we're just moving along one demand curve, if the only thing that's happening is price is changing and the consumer is saying, price went up, I should buy less, demand is not changing. What we say instead is that the quantity demanded has changed. So if the only thing that's changing is the price, we say that the quantity demanded has changed. Now, if this entire table changes for some reason, or the function changes, or the whole line shifts to the right or the left, that is when we say demand has changed. And in order for somebody's willingness and ability to buy certain quantities at certain prices, in order for that whole relationship to change, what we want to do is identify something like one of these six ideas over here that has changed. Either consumer income or wealth has gone up or down, population has changed, the number of people buying something, people's tastes and preferences that reflects their willingness to buy something has changed. The prices or availability of other related goods like complements or substitutes has changed. Somebody has put a sales or excise tax on a product or removed a tax on a product, or consumer expectations about the future. For example, if you think your income might go up soon, or if you think the price might change in a few days, that will change your willingness and ability to buy different quantities right now, right? All right, with that idea in mind about demand, let's talk about supply. Once you understand demand, supply is fairly simple because we see the same kind of ideas all over again. So, whereas demand is the willingness and ability of people to buy different quantities at different prices they might see, supply is their willingness and ability of businesses to produce certain quantities at different prices they might see. And very similarly, if the only thing that's happening is that the price is changing, the price of what they're selling is going up or the price of what they're selling is going down, if that's all we see, we don't say that supply has changed. Instead, we say the quantity supplied has changed. So let's look at an example of a supply schedule and a supply curve and a supply equation. So suppose I'm a business and I'm supplying something. And we used pizza as our example last time. Let's kind of stick with the example of pizza. So suppose I'm a restaurant owner and my willingness to sell per person in the neighborhood that I serve, I might say, okay, well, for each particular price I might be able to sell pizza for, here is the quantity I'm willing to supply at each of those prices. And I might think to myself as a business owner, well, how many would I be willing to supply if people aren't willing to pay anything? Suppose people come in and the only thing they want is pizza for free. what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell them I'm not willing to sell any. And what if people are willing to pay $1 for each slice of pizza? Well, then per person in this neighborhood that I serve, I might be willing to sell still none. It just might not be worth it for me to get all the ingredients and pay the employees and make the pizza and put it in the oven if I'm just going to be able to sell it for $1 a slice. So what if I could sell these for $2? Well, then I might be able to sell one slice per person in this neighborhood where most of my customers come from. And if the price is $3, maybe I'd be willing to sell 2 per person. $4, 3 per person. $5, 4 per person, etc. So this would be what we call a supply schedule. Let's graph these points and see what they look like. So 0, 0. And again, we're putting price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. So at a price of $1, I'd still be willing to sell 0. At a price of $2, I'd be willing to sell 1. At a price of $3, I'd be willing to sell 2, etc. Each time I can sell for another $1, I'm willing to sell one more slice of pizza. So we're going up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1. And let's connect all those dots with a straight line. And you make sure that you're doing this along with me. Do each little step and make sure you understand each little step that we're doing. And normally we're going to want to label this with a S so that everybody knows what we're graphing here as a supply curve. And finally, in addition to the supply schedule and the supply curve, we usually also want to represent this information as an equation because it's much more powerful. So we might write this as P, since that's on the y-axis, equals the y-intercept, which is 1, plus, and what's the slope of this supply curve? Well, rise over run. Between each 2 points, we are rising 1 and going over 1, rising 1 and going over 1. So the rise over run is 1 over 1, and so 1 plus 1q. Or we could just write that as 1 plus q would be our supply equation. So if I'm a business, we can very easily look up for any price what quantity I would be willing to supply per person in this neighborhood. So if we were starting out and the price was $3 that I could sell pizza for today, and then tomorrow I could sell pizza for $5, what we would say is when the price went up from $3 to $5, my quantity supplied increased. Quantity supplied just tells us that when I saw the price go up, I was willing to sell more. The only thing changing was the price that I could sell for. Nothing else was changing that's fundamental about my willingness and ability to produce except for the price of the product I'm selling. Okay, so we use quantity supplied to communicate that with people. Price went up, so I wanted to sell more. I decided to hire some more employees or keep my employees longer or work harder, use more resources to produce more in response to the higher price. Quantity supplied has changed, or quantity supplied has gone up in this case. And the law of supply is what we're talking about here. The law of supply says that when the price goes up, the quantity businesses are willing to sell, the quantity supplied will increase in response to that incentive. You have a larger incentive to produce more, and businesses will respond. Quantity supplied goes up. Now, there are other things that can actually change this relationship, change this supply schedule, supply curve, or supply function. And here again, here's a list of 6 common things. There are some others we could probably list, but here are 6 common things that you should commit to memory and make sure you really understand why these things can change the willingness and ability of firms to produce different quantities at different prices they might see. Item number 1 here is technology is changing. What we mean here is that there has been either some kind of improvement in technology that makes producing this good faster, easier, or cheaper, and it could make you more willing and more able to produce a good at each price you might see. So at each price you would see before, you might be willing to produce more. So, for example, let's just represent this on the supply curve over here. If before, let's talk about pizza, because I've worked for several pizza restaurants before. In one restaurant I worked in, we had this oven that had like a conveyor belt on it. The big oven had a conveyor belt that went in one end and went out the other end. When you wanted to cook a pizza, you just put the pizza down on this end, and the pizza automatically, when it was done, it just kept going slowly through the oven with the fire in here, right? And it would just go slowly through the oven, and when it came out the other side, you would know that it was perfectly cooked. The pizzas could kind of land over here on an area, and they wouldn't get burned, and you didn't have to run over there really quickly to check on the pizza all the time. It took care of itself. So that made it a lot cheaper and a lot easier to cook pizzas compared to your standard place that might have an oven that looks like this, that has a little door that you have to open up, or two little doors maybe, that you have to open up, and you have to keep looking in the oven to see when the pizza's done. That wastes a lot of time, and it increases the cost to produce pizzas. So suppose we got one of these really cool ovens here. How would that change our willingness and ability to produce pizzas? Well, what we might say then is, well, if the price is $2, I'd be willing to produce 3 pizzas now. And if the price was $3, maybe I'd be willing to produce 4. And if the price was $4, I'd be willing to produce 5 units, etc., right? So anytime you get a point that's over here to the right of the supply curve, you know that something has happened to cause us to have a new supply curve. And what would we want to call this new supply curve? Is this going to be an increase in supply or a decrease in supply? Well, anytime the supply curve shifts to the right, which means that we have a higher amount that we're willing to sell at each price compared to before, then that's an increase in supply, okay? So because we can say that one of these items here, technology got better, making it cheaper and easier to produce pizza, it's clear that we can say that supply changed. Supply increased in this case. Now, the opposite could happen. We could have a restaurant that already had one of these cool ovens, but then it breaks. So we could have technology changing, but it could be changing for the worse. Or we could have a case where businesses had good technology, and then this technology is outlawed. An example of this would be, we might have some kind of pesticide that farmers use, and this pesticide is found to be dangerous to wildlife or dangerous to the environment, and so the government passes a law outlawing this pesticide, like DDT. In that case, that's making your technology from the farmer's perspective worse, and that's going to mean that you are going to be less willing and able to produce compared to before, and so that would cause a decrease in supply. Okay, so anything that makes it harder to produce is going to decrease supply. Anything that makes it easier or cheaper to produce is going to increase supply. All right, so what else could actually change supply rather than just changing quantity supplied? Again, you can't say this enough. Quantity supplied is just if a business is responding to the price getting higher or lower. We say they're changing their quantity supplied in response to a price change of the thing that they're selling. Things that can change supply are changing something more fundamental about the business and their willingness and ability, or the industry and their willingness and ability to supply product. Now, item number 2 here is the size of the industry might be changing. By size of the industry, we mean that the number of producers in this industry is getting higher or lower. So let's imagine that in addition to the pizza place that we're talking about, a second, roughly identical pizza place opens up in the neighborhood. What would happen? Well, if each of these 2 pizza places are roughly identical and had the same supply schedule, when we add the second producer in the market, what we would expect is that the quantities they're willing and able to produce at each price is going to double now that there are two of these producers, right? So what we would look for is at a price of $1. Before, if there was just me, I'd be willing to produce 0 units. Well, now if it's me and another person that's identical, we'd both be willing to supply 0 units. 0 plus 0 is still 0. So this point here, this blue point, would be on this new supply curve when we have two producers. But at a price of $2, I was willing to supply 1. And if there's another person also willing to supply 1, 1 plus 1 is 2. So now both of us together at a price of $2 should be willing to supply 2 units, 1 each. And if at a price of 3, I used to be willing to supply 2, well, my new competitor now, he should be willing to supply 2 as well. It should double. 2 plus 2 is 4. So at a price of $3, we should see the quantity supplied be 4 units. So instead of, when the price goes up, we see 1 more unit being produced, now each time the price goes up, we see 2 additional units being produced. And that rise of 1 and run of 2 tells us that this new slope is going to be 1 over 2, or 1/2. So we're going up 1 over 2, up 1 over 2, up 1 over 2, and here is our new supply curve. And we might call that supply new, or supply with a little 2 on it, so that we know that that's the new supply curve now that we have 2 producers in the market. So if we have additional producers coming in, we see that at each price the quantity is getting higher. That's an increase in supply. Or the opposite could happen, where we used to have 2 producers and now we're going down to 1. The supply could decrease. My favorite story about this is when I was in college up at Appalachian State University in the mountains of North Carolina. Pretty soon you learn that about every September or October you need to take your car to the gas station and get your antifreeze checked. Because if your antifreeze level and mixture is not exactly right, then your entire radiator can freeze and it can crack, and that costs you a lot of money. It's a whole lot better just to go to the gas station, and usually for a couple of bucks they'd check the levels, tell you what you needed, and if you needed some antifreeze, that maybe they'd add some for $4 or $5. Wasn't all that expensive compared to a cracked radiator. One year I went to get my antifreeze checked, and they said I needed some antifreeze, and they were going to charge me, I think, $15 instead of the usual $4 or $5 to add some antifreeze. I said, "What are you doing? This is a ripoff." And he said, "I don't know. It's not our fault. Our cost of getting antifreeze has really skyrocketed, and so sorry, we have to pass that increase in costs over to our customers." And turns out I was reading up a little while later about why this happened, and back then there were 2 major antifreeze producers in the United States, and one of the factories blew up. There was an explosion, and instead of having 2 producers like we have here with this blue supply curve, we were left with 1 producer like in this black supply curve, and what happened was it caused the price to go way up when we lost that factory. So what else could cause our supply to change here? Item number 3, prices and availability of inputs are changing. So remember those inputs that we talked about in previous chapters: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. If all of a sudden it costs us more for the capital, or more for the labor, or more for our raw materials, land, we're going to be less willing and able to produce. If the prices for our workers or their entrepreneurs or the prices for any of these inputs go up, what's going to happen is this is going to cause a decrease in supply. So a shift to the left is always a decrease in supply, and a shift to the right is always an increase in supply. Same thing with demand, by the way. A shift to the right is always an increase, like in this one. This shift to the right is an increase in demand. A shift to the left is a decrease in demand. Works the same way with supply. So examples of this might be if we pass a minimum wage law in the United States and we raise the minimum wage from what it is now to say $15. There are some movements in the United States to raise the minimum wage to $10 or $15, and some people even are arguing for higher figures, $20 or $25 per hour. Any businesses that hire people where they right now pay them less than $15 or $20 or $25 per hour are going to have a lower willingness and ability to produce now than they used to. So we're going to have a decrease in supply. On the other hand, if I figure out a way to get around the minimum wage law, or might hire some illegal aliens who I don't have to pay the minimum wage to, then that might increase my supply, although doing it illegally. And I'm not encouraging that. I'm just saying, businesses do what they do sometimes. So if your inputs get cheaper, you're going to be more willing and able to supply. If your inputs get more expensive, you're going to be less willing and able to supply. Now, item number 4 here is kind of complicated. This is the most complicated one. It's kind of similar with demand to what we were talking about with complements and substitutes. So make sure to be careful here and pay close attention. Item number 4 says the prices of other possible outputs are changing. So what we're saying here is that any business usually has more than one thing they could possibly produce. A wheat farmer, well, they don't have to produce wheat. They could produce corn or soybeans or cotton or all kinds of things, right? And a pizza restaurant doesn't have to produce slices of pizza. They could also produce lasagna, spaghetti, sandwiches, all kinds of different things. So if there's something else that you could be making or you do already make, and the price of that changes, what we're saying here in number 4 is that logically what this business might do is shift resources towards some other possible output that is now more expensive, that they can sell for a higher price, and shift resources away from the thing that is now relatively less expensive, the thing that's prices didn't change. So as an example, let's suppose that the story is here that even though on the x-axis what we're analyzing here is pizza, right? This is primarily a pizza restaurant. Primarily they sell pizza. However, the price that people are willing to pay for lasagna all of a sudden increases. For some reason, there's some movie or there's some television show or some cartoon that has people eating lasagna, and all of a sudden everybody in the United States just can't get enough lasagna. So you used to be able to sell a little piece of lasagna for, say, $8. Now you can sell a little piece of lasagna for $20. Again, we're not talking about changing the price of pizza. That's what's on this y-axis here is the price of pizza. The price of lasagna changes. So if you could either have your workers making pizzas, which is still the same price as before, whatever that was, or you could have your workers now making lasagna, which you can sell for $20 a slice instead of the regular $8, what are you going to do? Well, what you're probably going to do is reassign many of your employees away from pizza and toward lasagna. And what that means is that you are going to be less willing and able to produce pizza compared to before. So you might say, well, if people are only willing to pay me $3 for a slice of pizza, I'm not willing to produce 2 slices anymore. Maybe I'd be willing to produce 1. And if people are willing to pay me $6 for a slice of pizza, I used to be willing to supply 5 units right here. No longer. Now, maybe I'm only willing to supply 2 slices of pizza at that price. I really want my people making lasagna because that's really where the money's at right now. So what we're going to see is a decrease in the supply for pizza because we see this shift to the left. And the opposite could be said, right? So if all of a sudden people don't want lasagna or spaghetti or the other things you're making as much, you might say, you know what, guys, we're not going to make lasagna or spaghetti anymore. From now on, it's all pizza all the time. Now you have more space in your restaurant and more employees to put on pizza. So if you could only sell that lasagna for 50 cents, then maybe that would increase your supply of pizza. You're more willing and able to make the thing that you can make relatively more money at, and less willing to make the things that are now relatively less profitable compared to the other thing. All right? So prices of other possible outputs. The difficulty people have with this one is keeping it straight which product we're talking about, because we're not just talking about pizza anymore. Now we're talking about two things, like pizza and lasagna. A similar kind of struggle people have sometimes when we're talking about complements and substitutes, because we're talking about two different goods. You have to keep straight which one we're talking about in our graph over here and which one we're talking about has changed in price. Let me just give you one other quick example of the prices of other possible outputs here. A few years ago, when the price of gasoline was up around $3 or $4 a gallon, Ford and Chevy and all the other car manufacturers found that they just couldn't sell SUVs anymore for high prices. That if they were going to sell SUVs, people weren't willing to pay as much because the price of gas was so high. So what most of these car manufacturers did is they shifted resources away from producing SUVs and toward producing hybrid cars. And so when people aren't willing to pay as much for SUVs, the supply of hybrid cars went up. Okay? Businesses were more willing and able to sell the hybrids because the SUVs just weren't profitable anymore. Another kind of obvious one here is business taxes. So if you put some kind of tax on a product or on a business and you make it more expensive, more costly, more difficult to do business, then that is going to reduce your willingness and ability to produce. On the other hand, if you cut taxes on businesses, make it easier and cheaper for them to produce, then that will make them more willing and able to produce. So if you increase taxes, that could decrease supply. If you decrease taxes and make businesses more willing and able to produce, that could increase the supply. Businesses are more willing to supply more at each price because you're saving them money when you charge them less in taxes. And the last item, S6, producer expectations about the future. This is very similar to what we were talking about with demand up here, consumer expectations about the future. And let me use a similar kind of example that we did when we were talking about demand. Suppose you're a producer, you're selling gasoline. Okay, so instead of pizza, here we're talking about the quantity of gasoline you're willing to sell at each price of gas that you might see. And the quantity along the x-axis here might be thousands of gallons that you're willing to sell. Suppose you as a seller or a producer of gasoline, suppose you expect, it hasn't happened yet, but you expect the price that you can sell gas for this weekend to go up to $5 per gallon. Suppose right now the price of gasoline is about $2.50 or so, right? So right now we're right about here on the supply curve. The price is about $2.50 for gas, and you're willing to sell maybe about 1,500, 1.5 thousand gallons of gas right now. What would you do? How would you react if the price of gas hasn't changed yet, but you have it on good authority that you could be selling gas this weekend for $5 per gallon instead of $2.50 per gallon? You think this weekend that gas is going to become very scarce. What would you do? Well, if I were a business and I had the choice of either selling the gas that I have on hand at my gas station for $2.50 today, or I could wait, hold on to all that gas and sell it for $5 per gallon this weekend, I'm going to shut down, right? I'm not going to be willing or able, I'd be able, but not willing to sell any gas today for $2.50 or anything. I might be willing to sell some for $5 today, but you can kind of see how that's going to decrease our willingness and ability to supply today. And so that's going to be a decrease in supply. Even though nothing's happened to the price of gas, the fact that we think something's going to happen tomorrow might affect our willingness to sell today. Okay. Last thing we want to do in this video is quickly put together supply and demand, and we'll do a quick example of looking at equilibrium here. So let's match up this supply curve that we have graphed with the demand curve that we had from our last example up here. P equals 12 minus 2Q. And let's look for the equilibrium and talk about what equilibrium actually means. So 12 minus 2q is going to look like this, just like we graphed it last time. And let's see where this demand and supply curve intersect. It looks like somewhere the price is going to be just a little bit below $5, and the quantity looks to be between 3 and 4. Just to make this a little easier, let's change that demand. Here I change the equation to demand to P equals 13 minus 2Q. So that when we talk about equilibrium here, we're talking about whole numbers. Now, we're not always going to have whole number answers when we do these kind of problems, but for our first one, let's make it easier. As you can probably remember from reading the chapter, equilibrium, what we're looking for is where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. But let's talk about why that's the equilibrium, okay? Well, first let's talk about what the equilibrium is. So what's the equilibrium price? Looks like it's $5. What's the equilibrium quantity? Looks like it's 4 units. So we call that the equilibrium. So why equilibrium? What does the word equilibrium actually mean? Well, when you look up the word equilibrium in the dictionary, it actually means balance. So when we're looking for an equilibrium, we were looking for a place where things are in balance. Well, what is it that we want to be in balance? Well, the price of $5 and the quantity of 4, that's an equilibrium, or that's in balance, because $5 is the only price where the quantity people want to buy on this demand curve here is equal to the quantity that people want to sell on the supply curve. It's the only place where the quantity demanded is in balance equals the quantity supplied. So that's what we mean, that's what we're talking about when we say equilibrium. We're looking for a price where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. The quantity people want to buy is equal to the quantity people want to sell. Otherwise, we are not in equilibrium. So let's look at some cases that aren't equilibrium. That makes it a little easier to see what we mean by being in equilibrium. So suppose we were not in equilibrium. We were not at a price of $5 and we were not at a quantity of 4 units, but let's suppose for some reason that we were at a price of $7. What would be going on at that point? What would the demanders be thinking? Well, if we look on the demand curve here, it looks like demanders would say, hey, we want to buy a quantity of 3. So we'd say the quantity demanded is 3 at a price of 7. What would the producers be thinking at a price of $7? If we hop over here and look at the supply curve, we can see that the quantity supplied at a price of 7 would be 6 units. Suppose the price was $7 today, what would happen? Sellers would be bringing 6 units to sell. Buyers would only want to buy 3 units. And we would have 3 units left over that nobody wanted to buy. What are we going to call those 3 units that are left over? Yeah, we're going to call that a surplus. Surplus is something that's left over. So we can kind of look at that distance there between the 6 and the 3, and we're going to have 1, 2, 3 units left over in a surplus. Okay, well, what's going to happen next? If you're a business and you thought you were going to sell 6, but you only sold 3, and you had 3 left over, what are you going to do tomorrow differently from what you did today? Well, you're going to be doing 2 things. Number 1, tomorrow you're probably going to produce less because you have a lot left over, right? And the second thing you're probably going to do is you're going to lower your price to try to get rid of this surplus. Just go to any clothing store and see what they do with their surplus clothes. They weren't able to sell at the price they initially tried to sell it at. They put them on clearance, right? So tomorrow the business is going to be lowering their price and producing less, and that means that we're going to be getting closer to that equilibrium price of $5. and closer to that equilibrium quantity of 4 units. Sometimes we call this idea the law of market forces. The law of market forces just says that if the price is not in equilibrium, if something's out of balance, then naturally market forces are going to push us toward that equilibrium. If we're at a price of 7, we're going to naturally gravitate toward that equilibrium price, where businesses are going to be producing less. As the price goes down, consumers are going to be buying more, and eventually we'll get to that equilibrium price of $5, where the amount being sold is equal to the amount being purchased. What if we were at a price that was too low? It was lower than that equilibrium price, say something like a price of $3. At a price of $3, tell me, what are the suppliers thinking here? The suppliers are thinking that they would only want to sell 2 units at a price of $3. What are the demanders thinking at a price of $3? Let's hop on over here to the demand curve. At a price of $3, looks like they would like to buy 5. Okay, well, what do you call it if consumers are out there trying to buy 5? The quantity demanded is 5 units, and the quantity supplied is only 2 units. What do we call that difference? Well, people want 3 more than there are. We call that a shortage of 3 units. So it's a shortage because people want to buy more than there is, and there's a shortage of 3 units, 5 minus 2. So we commonly see shortages and surpluses in the market, and sometimes they just happen because there's a new product introduced and people don't really know what the price should be. So if you're a business and you're starting out and you're pricing a brand new product, you might price it too low, you might price it too high, and then you're going to have to adjust. Sometimes we see shortages and surpluses because something changes. Business costs go up, or the demand for a product suddenly increases, and that might cause a surplus or a shortage. Or sometimes it's because the government passes a law, and that causes a surplus or a shortage. So let's go through that example very quickly, and then we'll end this video for today. And then in the next video, we'll do a lot more examples with supply and demand and changing supply and demand and equilibrium. So let's suppose that we're in equilibrium. Everything's fine. Businesses are charging $5 per unit, and people are buying 4 units. Businesses are also producing 4 units. There's no problem. But then the government says, you know what? I want to help out consumers. We don't want these consumers to be ripped off, pay too much for this product. And so they pass a law. And the kind of law we're going to talk about is a price ceiling. A price ceiling puts a cap or a lid or a ceiling on the highest possible price. And a price ceiling law says it's illegal to charge more than $3 in this case. So if the price was already $5, this is effectively going to lower the price you're allowed to charge down to $3. Well, let me ask you a couple of questions here, just to review. After the government passes this price ceiling, what is going to happen to demand? The answer is nothing's going to happen to demand. Why? Well, demand, remember, is this entire line. And the entire line is not going to shift because the only thing that's changing is the price went down. So demand is not going to change. What's happening is we're moving along a demand curve from point A to point B, and the quantity demanded is going to increase from 4 to 5. So people see a lower price, they want to buy more. The quantity demanded goes up. QD up would be kind of a very shorthand way to write this. Now, after this price ceiling law gets passed, what's going to happen to supply? The answer? Nothing. Why? Well, because nothing is changing about these 6 things we talked about that can change supply. Technology didn't change, the number of producers, the availability of inputs or the price of inputs did not change, like your labor, your land, your capital, your entrepreneurship. The prices of other things you could sell didn't change. Taxes didn't change. Your expectations about the future didn't change. Today, the government said the price is going down. So, instead of saying supply changes, we're not shifting that supply curve. We say that the quantity supplied has changed, okay? It's nothing about the willingness and ability of firms to produce has changed. It's just the price they're allowed to charge has changed. So, the government's forcing us to move from this point A to point C, where now we're only willing to sell 2 units. So when you explain to someone the problem with a price ceiling, it's not that it changes demand or it changes supply. It's the fact that when people see a lower price, they want to buy more. Quantity demanded goes up. But when the price is forced downward like this, businesses want to produce fewer units. The quantity supplied goes down. And that creates this gap in between the quantity people want to buy and the quantity being produced, and that causes a shortage. Ask some older people in your life, somebody who's, say, older than 50 years old, about the gas shortages that we had in the United States back in the early 1970s. This was just when I was a baby, so I don't really remember. So it's got to be somebody who's, say, at least 55 years old. See if they remember about the Arab oil embargo in the early 1970s. The Arab oil embargo was a time when many countries in the Middle East said they were not going to sell oil to the United States anymore. And this raised the price of oil, which is an input to gas, and it really increased the price of gasoline. However, the United States government said, we don't want the price of gasoline to go up. Let's pass a law forbidding the price from rising. So instead of allowing the price of gas to rise, to keep our numbers the same, let's suppose the price was going to rise from $3 to $5, the government said, nope, the price cannot rise. The price has to stay $3. We're putting on a price ceiling at $3. And this caused huge gas shortages. The problem would be you'd be running out of gas in your car, you'd drive to a gas station and they wouldn't have any. And you'd just run out of gas. Another problem, you'd hear that a gas station had recently gotten some gas, and so everybody would run over there and everybody would wait in line trying to get the gas. You'd waste a lot of time, and a lot of people would run out of gas while waiting in line to buy gas. Government officials sometimes think they're helping consumers when they pass a price ceiling law, but they're not really helping anybody. It causes more problems than it's worth. It does help you if you're able to get the product for the cheap price, but usually you're not able to actually find it. So that's the story of a shortage. The opposite case of a price ceiling would be a price floor, and a price floor would be a minimum price. As an example, in the United States, we have a minimum price or a price floor holding up the price of milk. We also talked about the price floor we have on sugar in the United States. The problem with a price floor is that for suppliers, they want to supply more. The quantity supplied is higher than the quantity people actually want to buy, and this causes a surplus. And someone has to buy that extra surplus that consumers don't want to have to buy. Guess who buys the surplus milk in the United States? The government of the United States. So what happens is they take our tax dollars and they use it to buy this milk that nobody wants to buy, and we're paying higher taxes so that we can pay higher prices on milk than what we would see if the government weren't involved. Eventually what the government does with this milk is they turn it into cheese and dry milk powder, and most of it gets sent to foreign countries for disaster relief, food aid, things like that. So this has been our overview of demand versus quantity demanded, the things that can shift demand, and supply versus quantity supplied, and the things that can shift supply. What we're going to do in our next video is we're going to put supply and demand together. Suppose we're in equilibrium and then something changes. Demand shifts or supply shifts. Can we predict what's going to happen to price in the future and the quantity of this good that's going to be bought and sold in the future? This is the most powerful use of supply and demand, and that's what we're going to do in the next video. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye.